I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the young bloods, Ben and Ann, so much for their neighborly hospitality and friends that they've introduced us to Michael for his effort to organize this event, to my wife Barbara, and so many people who have come forward in a shower of affection and love in the past 3 or 4 weeks for me, that you've been part of my recovery by your active solidarity and your visitations and your conversations and your thoughts. I only wish that we could imagine a way to help our country recover as easily as it's been for me to recover over the past several weeks. This morning's news is just another devastating wave of information that is almost too much to bear. But in a sense, it suggests why we should have this conversation. And I think my old friend Ron Brownstein is not only one of the most able writers on American politics, but what he's been passionate about in the past 10 years, and I've known him for many decades, he's been passionate about in his own more expert way, what I have felt on a deep personal level, the division of our country. I started to feel it as a reaction when Barack Obama gave that historic speech about it being a red, white, and blue America, not a red America, not a white America, not a blue America. But it struck me then. Are the animal rights team here? Uh-oh, here comes Ben.
He's a Republican.
When Obama gave that speech in 2008, and you could feel the sense of transcendence in the country, and I was there on the floor. I had a sense of expectation combined with dread, because it's not been my experience that we're a unified country. Not since my birth, not since high school, not since the anti-war movement with Vietnam, not since the Nixon years. It's been a time of constant polarization around many of the issues that arose in the 1960s. And when I would look at the map, the kind of map that Ron is really an expert at discussing, I kept seeing that the country was divided along historic lines that go back centuries. One of them that we're reminded of tonight is the Civil War and slavery, the line of division that began with the first shots in South Carolina over a century ago. And it continues today in South Carolina and in other states that are falsely described as red, but they actually come out of the old Southern Confederacy. Another division that we've experienced is always about immigration, whether it's 100 years ago or today, but it's always been a dividing line in our country. And if you think about it in contemporary terms, the immigrant rights movement, the immigration issue today, is based on the war against Mexico and against indigenous people over a century ago. If you think of the divisions around women's rights to be autonomous people, those divisions go back to the Inquisition. They go back to the burnings at the stake, even in New England. They remind us that whether it's women or indigenous people or Mexicans or African Americans or the immigrant forefathers, that we're living through the tremulars or the turbulence or instability or shock that comes from 500 or 600 years of war and conflict and disruption and dislocation and immigration and suppression and discrimination and so on. And so it's not a red, white, and blue country. It's a country that is sharply divided and seems to many people I speak to impossibly divided. And they always ask the question, well, what are we going to do if it's impossibly divided? How do you get through the divisions? Some would say, be very clear, make sure that you elect a president of the United States who is going to appoint a Supreme Court that protects certain institutions. Make sure that you elect the most Democrats possible to the Senate and not lose that body, like we've lost the House, and be prepared for a long standoff in which there are many victories locally or statewide in California and many permanent defeats in places like South Carolina and Texas, but they don't have an answer to how we transcend the division, the paralysis. Will we somehow succeed? Will we overcome? Or will we be permanently blocked beyond recovery in a situation that is so hopeless for so many Americans economically and socially? I don't have an answer to that question. My life has been about keeping on and keeping up the fight and gaining victories where it's possible. But it's also been my experience that every time that I've seen something triumphant, there's been a counter movement and a reaction that sets in to try to destroy the gains, and it's a continual conflict between movements that succeed in achieving reform and in the process set off such a reaction and such hysteria from people who are opposed that everything sort of cancels itself out in one national election after another that's settled by 1% or 2% or 3%, and never anything better, and always the fear of something even worse coming to visit us. Sometimes I find that the question I have for Ron is, besides trying to explain what the choices are, is can he come up with a sort of mystical answer as opposed to a mathematical answer to the question, since the math makes it seem impossible, and by mystical I mean there's sometimes seems to be things in the air that alter history or alter a civilization. Little things that have happened since I went in the hospital. The publication of the papal encyclical, for instance, is probably one of the most important consciousness-changing documents in the history of humanity. Its effect is well beyond what people understand. But if you understand the history of religious wars, up to the Reagan administration and going way back to the early biblical days, this is an important document. And it came out of apparently nowhere. A man who was elected Pope by a secret process of democracy known as the Vatican
Conclave.
So if somebody like Ron could explain how this man was elected Pope, we would have many, many questions.
There was no exit poll.
But it was, my theory is that it was an extension of Latin America's liberation struggles, liberation theology. And it's reverberating in the immigrant rights movement today. But it is somewhat mystical that this would be issued in our midst when everything else seems to be going in the other direction. Last week, the Irish people, largely an Irish Catholic population, voted 62% for marriage equality. How did that happen in electoral politics? So I called up a friend of mine who is a former mayor of Belfast, and I said, what is going on? And he said, Tom, it's a very long generational struggle over many centuries, and you must keep your health to work with the young people. This is multi-generational. It's going on for a long time. And I said, yeah, but you and I know the Irish Catholics. We know where we come from. How did they do this? How did they vote 62% for marriage equality? These are the Irish Catholics. He said, we're done with discrimination. We're done with it. It's over.
Yeah, we're done.
It's amazing. Just said, we have been discriminated against so much for so many centuries. We're done. We're finished. It's over. Done. He couldn't even explain how this had happened. Then there was Nebraska deciding to get rid of the death penalty. How red is Nebraska? Ron will tell us. Then there's de Blasio. Then there's Elizabeth Warren. And now there's Bernie. Bernie coming out of nowhere. I only have one concern about Bernie. He's doing so well that he gave a speech for 80 minutes in 90-degree weather in Vermont, and I worry about his health. Everybody should tell him on Saturday to just shorten the speeches a little bit and drink a lot of water. But Bernie's in the air. It's kind of amazing, and the list really goes on. So maybe there is a chemistry that's social and historic. I don't know. Maybe there's a chemistry that does give rise to sudden alterations of the political environment, just like there are geological forces that give rise to earthquakes and tremors all around us. I have no explanation for how we get through this riddle, but I do feel that something is in the air, and I hope that Ron can address both the practical and the mechanical and the mathematical part of the riddle that we have to face, but also speculate on how certain impossible things, seemingly impossible things, do after all seem to happen in human history. Nobody better on this subject than Ron. I hope that you'll listen to him carefully. The material that he can leave with you, and it should be the basis for a wonderful discussion about how we approach a democratic solution to the impossible challenges that we face. Thanks so much, Ron, for giving us your time.